Welcome to A Slice with Dice, a podcast exploring the ideas, pressures, and possibilities shaping how we learn, lead, and grow. I'm Corey Alderdice. For over 20 years, my work has lived at the intersection of gifted education, leadership development, and school culture, supporting students as they find their strengths, educators as they stretch their thinking, and schools as they build pathways that expand opportunity. Ready to dive in? Here's this week's Slice. There's something different about reading a report like the one Yale University released this past month. Not in the moment it comes out, but in the days after. Once the headlines fade a bit, once it settles in with educators and leaders who are mindful of the broader conversations already taking place. Because what lingers isn't just what the report says, it's the fact that it says it at all. Elite institutions are not usually in the habit of naming their own vulnerabilities this directly. They might acknowledge challenges, they might gesture toward complexity, but this felt more candid than that, more like an institution looking in the mirror and choosing not to look away. And what it reflected back was something many people inside and outside of higher education already sensed. That trust has been eroding, that the public is less certain about what colleges and universities are doing, how they're making decisions, and whether the outcomes justify the cost. That even within institutions, there are questions about clarity, about purpose, about whether the system is as fair and as rigorous as it needs to be. Now, none of this is entirely new. But there's a difference between people saying it about you and saying it yourself. And that's where the real tension begins, because if higher education is going to rebuild trust, it almost has to start with that kind of honesty. There isn't a version of this where confidence is restored through better messaging alone. You don't rebuild credibility by polishing the surface. At some point, you have to engage the structure underneath. But the moment you do that publicly, explicitly, you introduce yourself to a different kind of risk. You give your critics something to point to, and in the current environment, those critics are not always interested in reform. In many cases, they're interested in something closer to constraint, or correction, or in some corners, something more fundamental than that. So when a place like Yale acknowledges concerns about cost or admissions opacity or academic rigor, it doesn't land as a nuanced internal critique. It gets flattened into something simpler. Proof that the system is broken, evidence that skepticism was justified all along. That translation is almost inevitable, and institutions know it, which creates a kind of paradox. The very act that is necessary to rebuild trust, honest self-assessment, can also accelerate the loss of trust in the short term, or at least amplify the voices that are already pushing in that direction. So what do you do with that? Because the alternative isn't especially appealing either. You can take a more defensive posture, emphasize outcomes, highlight success stories, frame concerns as misunderstandings. And there is some truth in all of that. Higher education, broadly speaking, still delivers extraordinary value for students. It still fuels research, innovation, mobility, opportunity. But if that's the only response, if everything becomes about defending the institution rather than improving it, people eventually notice the gap, the distance between what's being said and what's being experienced. And that gap is where trust continues to erode. So institutions now find themselves in a narrow space. They need to acknowledge enough to be credible, but not so much that they destabilize their position. They need to reform, but not in the ways that fundamentally undercut the mechanisms that made them successful in the first place. Because that's the deeper issue sitting underneath all of this. The modern elite university is built on a set of reinforcing dynamics. Selectivity creates prestige. Prestige attracts demand. Demand allows for flexibility. Flexibility in admissions, in pricing, and how decisions are made and explained. And that flexibility, in many ways, is part of the value proposition. It allows institutions to shape a class, to build a community, to pursue multiple goals at once. But the very things that make that model work, opacity, discretion, the absence of rigid formulas, are the same things that make it harder to defend in an environment that is asking for transparency, fairness, and clarity. Trust, in that sense, asks for one set of conditions. Power depends on another. And I think that's the question that sits very much at the center of this moment. Can higher education rebuild trust without giving up the very mechanisms that give it influence? Or perhaps to put it a little more plainly, are institutions willing to trade some degree of power for restored credibility? So far, the early signals suggest a kind of middle path. Other leading institutions, places like Harvard or Stanford, are not pushing back on the premise. There's general agreement that trust is an issue. You see continued movement on financial aid. You see statements about transparency and openness. You see efforts to address campus climate and academic culture. But you don't see a rush toward the most difficult reforms. At least not yet. You don't see institutions fully opening up the admissions process. You don't see a widespread dismantling of legacy preferences. You don't see aggressive moves to reset grading norms in a way that would fundamentally change how academic performance is signaled. And the hesitation, well, it isn't surprising because those changes don't just improve trust, they also introduce risk. Competitive risk, reputational risk, internal friction with faculty, alumni, and stakeholders who are very much invested in the current model. No institution wants to be the one that moves first if it means stepping slightly out of alignment with its peers. So there's a kind of collective pause, a wait-and-see approach, agreement at the level of principle, caution at the level of practice. And in that hesitation, the question becomes less about whether higher education understands the problem. It clearly does. The question is whether it can move from an understanding perspective to action in a way that is both meaningful and sustainable. Because there's another risk, and, surprisingly, it's a bigger one. If institutions become too concerned about how their critiques might be used externally, they can start to pull back internally. The instinct shifts from reflection to protection, from asking hard questions to managing exposure. And when that happens, the opportunity for genuine reform begins to narrow, not because the will isn't there, but because the environment makes it harder to act on that will. Which brings this conversation a little closer to home, because these tensions aren't confined to elite universities. They don't suddenly appear at age 18. They're already present earlier in the pipeline in places that are also trying to balance access, excellence, and opportunity under a very public lens. You can see it in selective high schools and specialized programs in environments where admission is limited, expectations are high, and outcomes carry real weight. In those spaces, the same questions show up, just with less insulation. How transparent should the process be? What does fairness actually look like? How do you maintain rigor without becoming exclusionary? How do you expand opportunity without diluting what makes the experience meaningful? But there's an important difference. At the university level, institutions often have time. Time to study the issue, time to write reports, time to move deliberately. In selective K-12 environments, that time doesn't always exist. When trust breaks down, the response is often immediate, public, political, structural. Admission systems change, policies get rewritten, external actors step in. In other words, what universities are beginning to analyze, selective schools have been forced to live through, and that creates a different kind of question. Not just whether institutions understand the tension between trust and power, but whether they can get ahead of it. Whether they can design for trust because they're required to respond to its absence. Because once change is driven externally, the conversation tends to simplify. Nuance gets lost, trade-offs disappear, and systems are reshaped under pressure rather than through intention. So maybe the most important question coming out of this moment isn't just what places like Yale will do next. It's whether other institutions, schools, programs, systems that sit earlier in the pipeline will wait for that same pressure, or whether they'll take a different approach. whether they'll be willing to name their trade-offs clearly, to define their purpose more precisely, to describe their experience honestly. Not because they have to, but because doing so might be the only way to build trust that actually lasts. And that's a different kind of challenge. Not reacting to a loss of trust, but designing it from the beginning. A Slice with Dice is a production of Aldercube. Thanks for making time to reflect with me. If you're finding value in these episodes, I hope you'll subscribe and help spread the word. Until next time, lead boldly, listen closely, and keep pushing forward. I'll see you then.